G'day everyone, let me show you how to remove and replace the color background of this image in Photoshop. My name is Hoy and this is the third in my background removal series. Because different subjects require different ways of removing the background, we need a range of tools and techniques to make the best selection. In this video, we'll use the color range feature to remove this green background. So if you haven't already done so, make sure you check out my first two videos on background removal where I show you how to remove the background of a simple logo, cut out this car and model, and blend it onto another background. So no matter what you want to cut out, you can follow along using the exact images that I'm using. Links to the first two videos and the image that I'll be using in this video are in the description. Okay, so to get started, let's open the image that we'll be using by going to File, Open, navigate to the folder where you've got your image saved under and double click on the image. First, I'm going to fit this to screen by pressing Command 0 on my keyboard. The next thing I'll do is unlock this background layer by pressing this padlock here. I'm going to double click on the word Layer 0 just to rename it to something like Fruits. I'm going to press Enter on my keyboard. While this is a simple project, it's always good habit to name your layers so you can keep track of them as you go along. So the first step is to make a selection of the green background by using the color range feature. Now, color range is not the only way to make a selection of the background, but because the background is relatively uniform with green, there's a way to make a selection of this green. To do that, let's go to Select, click on Color Range, and here you'll see the color range dialog box. Now, because I want your screen to look like mine so you can follow along, let's just go through two settings that we need to set before I go through all the settings on this dialog box. First, let's select Selection here. This will make this part of the screen into a mask mode, which is basically a black and white representation of the image. Don't click on Image, which will just show you the image with full color. So select Selection, and with your selection preview, select None. I'll go through all the other options a bit later, but for the time being, these two options should do you well. Let's go back up to the first option here called Select. The default is on sample color, and what that means is that Photoshop will make a selection of whatever color that you select. Now, there are other options here. Now, if I just click on that, you can select red, yellows, green, cyan, blues, magentas, etc., etc. We won't go through all the options, but I'll just show you one to show you what it does. So if I just select reds, Photoshop here will select all the reds. Now on a mask like this, white reveals and black conceals. Now let's just explain that a little bit more. So if I change my selection preview from None to Black Matte, here I've got a representation of what Photoshop will select. What it will select is highlighted in red, the cranberries. What won't show up is the black areas here. And what you see sort of in transparent color is the yellow bit. Even though the lemons are yellow, it does have a little bit of red in it. So let's reselect our sample colors from the select options and then just change our selection preview to None again. Now, the next step is to make a selection of what you want Photoshop to select. So make sure you have this eyedropper tool selected here, and then just go onto your canvas and click once here. And what you'll see on this image here is white dots with a black background here. And what the white means is that it will show up, and the black area is what won't show up in the selection. Now, this option is quite limited, because if I keep clicking on the background, it will make a new selection each time. And that's not very helpful. What we want to do is to be able to make a selection to add to the existing selection. Now, there's two ways you can do that. We can go back to the dialog box and press this option here, or you can keep it on this eyedropper tool option here, and then on your keyboard, press Shift. When you have Shift pressed on your keyboard, you'll see this little plus icon here. Now, if you don't see this plus icon, it most likely means that you probably don't have a eyedropper tool option selected. So if I simulate that, so I deselect that, and then I go back to the canvas and I press Shift, you see how I don't have a plus, but I have a little ring above the eyedropper tool. If you have that, just make sure that you have a eyedropper tool selected first. So now let's make a selection out of the background here. I'm going to press Shift on my keyboard and I'm going to click and drag around the area that I want selected. So I'm just going to go select here, click, drag, drag, drag. I've got Shift held on my keyboard and I'm just dragging my mouse all over where I want to select. I'm going to go back up here, and what I'm looking at is the black and white image on the right side. Now let's go through what this dialog box shows again. Now remember, white reveals and black conceals, which means that whatever's white will show up in the selection and whatever's black won't show up. Now the problem here is that the selection is exactly the opposite of what we don't want. By that I mean that we want to reveal the fruits, the lemon, the grapes, the cranberries, and we want to conceal the background. But the reason why we made a selection of the background instead of these fruits is because it's much easier to make a selection of the background here instead of trying to pick out these individual fruits. But now we have a problem. But thankfully, there's an easy way to get around it, but we'll get there when we finish our selection. So I'm going to keep selecting the background until I get most of what I can. So all this area here, this fuzziness, goes away. So I'm going to go back to my canvas, press Shift on my keyboard, and then I'm going to keep dragging until I'm satisfied with my selection. And there'll come a point where you're not really sure what you're selecting anymore, because this image here, you're not sure whether, well, is that the lemon or is that the shadow? I don't know. So wouldn't it be great to have an alternative view? And luckily there is. Let's go down to the selection preview option. Here we've got it at none. Now there's several options here. We can go grayscale. Now what grayscale means is simply your classic mask, which is a black and white representation of your image. Again, white reveals and black conceals, which is a tagline to say whatever's white will show up after we make a mask out of it. Whatever's black will not show up, and we'll invert our mask later on. The other selection preview options are black matte. And again, instead of showing white where it will show up, it will actually show you the original image. So where you see the color, that will show up. Where you see black, it won't show up. The other option is white matte. Now what white matte is pretty much the same as black matte, but instead of black, it's using white. The colored area of the original image that we see here will show up after we make a mask, and the white area won't show up. The last option here is the quick mask. Now what the quick mask shows again is the colored background here, but instead of black and white in the areas that won't show up, it has a red transparent overlay, and that gives us some visibility, transparency that we can see through, that will help with our selection. So this is the selection option that I'm going to use, because I can now differentiate what is the shadow and what is the fruit. Now before I make further selection, I want to explain what these two options are: the localized color clusters and the fuzziness, because that will help us refine the next selection. Let's start off with the fuzziness slider. And what fuzziness means is basically the tolerance, or how much Photoshop can deviate from your sample color. So at the moment, the fuzziness is set at 0, which means that whatever sample colors I've told Photoshop to select, it's not going to deviate from that. If I increase the fuzziness from 0 to say 20, 30, something like this, 33 even, you can see on the left-hand side, some of the red areas, especially in the shadows here, has disappeared. And that's because it's saying that in addition to the sample color that I've told Photoshop to sample, Photoshop will now take that as well as 33 shades lighter and 33 shades darker than the sample colors. Now this fuzziness slider goes all the way up to 200. Now if I go 200, then basically it's saying that it will select the colors that I've told it to select plus 200 shades lighter or darker, which is why now you see that basically the whole image is selected. So obviously 200 is too much. It's not what we want. So what we should do is dial it all the way down to 0, and then incrementally slide the slider to the right, and then just keep watch on the right hand side to see how much of the shadows have disappeared. What we should be looking at is the edges here. If we have a blotch of red in the middle of the picture here, which is not touching any fruits, that's okay. It's kind of like painting. We're worried about the edges, not so much the body, because the body we can sort of paint out relatively quickly. So if I zoom in here by pressing Option on the keyboard and scroll wheel mouse up, let's just use this slider and keep an eye out for this. I'm going to slide this back here just to emphasize the point here. And now let's just watch this area while we slide the slider. So I'm going to slide it. I'm less worried about what the number is and more worried about what's happening on the picture itself. So something like this will do. I do have to be mindful of the impact that it might have on the rest of the picture. So I'm going to zoom back out by pressing Option on my keyboard and scroll wheel mouse down. And I'm going to use the slider again, and I'm going to exaggerate the effect so you know how to combat a problem if I exaggerate this way too much here. So as you can see, it's deselected too much here. So I'm going to go back here to something like 30, 29 even. Now let's see whether the localized color clusters option will help us in this instance. Let's check that. This is similar to the contiguous effect in a selection tool. It means how local will the selection be. At the moment, when I tick this option on, the range is at 100. It means that whatever fuzziness level I dial here, it's taking the whole picture into consideration. So if I dial this back to 29, which is I think what we had, and then I'll dial this back here to something like 20%, it means that the fuzziness will only work on 20% of the picture. So let's do that again. Something like 57 is fine. I'm going just to center this a little bit on screen again so we can see the full picture. Now you can see the selection has been made and the areas that won't show is highlighted in red. In this area, in the bowl containing the cranberries, I'm just going to zoom in a bit. You can see that the bowl is not selected. So, which means that we've used the fuzziness slider too much. But instead of readjusting it, I'm going to show you another method of how to fix that. I'm going to pan up here to see what it's done to the shadow. I'm going to zoom in by pressing Option on my keyboard and scroll wheel mouse up. Now it's relatively clean here. There is a bit of artifacts here, which you can see better if I do black matte or maybe grayscale even. So you can see there's still a little bit of transparency here, so we'll fix that using another technique. If I scroll across to see the lemon here, you see there are gray bits instead of solid black and white. In a mask, what we want is a solid black or white. A gray color means that it's transparent, and we'll fix that using the mask later. What we're worried about at the moment is just the edges. I'm going to zoom back out by pressing Option on the keyboard and scroll wheel mouse down. I'm going to pan down to see the grapes. I'm going to change my view here to quick mask again. And what I'm looking for here is whether the edges are fine. Because if the edges are not fine, it's going to be a lot harder to fix those edges. Now there is a bit of transparency here, which is relatively easy to fix. So that I'm not worried about. Let's fit this image to screen by pressing Command 0 on the keyboard. And finally, let's invert the mask by pressing this button here. Now remember, black conceals and white reveals. So this selection will show all the fruits that are shown in white here and won't show the black here. I'm going to press OK here. Now Photoshop has made a selection out of this. The next step is to make a mask. Let's go down to the mask layer icon here. You can immediately see that there is some transparency here, but to make it easier to see, let's create a solid color behind it. By clicking here, go up to solid color, and then just pick any color that you want. I'm going to choose this bluish hue here, just to contrast it against the fruits. I'm going to press OK. I'm going to move this down here, and here we can see the mask a little bit better and see the areas that we need to fix. Again, we need to fix this problem area here. Now the first mask that we're going to fix is this bowl here, the cranberries. Let's go to our marquee tool here. We'll be using the elliptical marquee tool. If you don't see the marquee tool, you'll probably see the default, which is the rectangular marquee tool. If so, just click and hold until you see these options fly out, and then select the elliptical marquee tool. Let's go back to the canvas. Let's click and drag and constrain this ellipse to a perfect circle by pressing Shift on our keyboard. The problem is that the circle is not in exactly the position that I want it to be. So instead of redoing the marquee with Shift and my mouse still clicked, I'm going to press spacebar on my keyboard, and that will give me the ability to move the selection around. I'm going to place it to where the marquee should be. I'm going to release my spacebar. I've still got Shift pressed on my keyboard and my left mouse click, and now I'm going to resize it as appropriate. I'm going to do that until I get it to the size that I want, and then again press spacebar on my keyboard with Shift and left mouse button click just to move the selection into a place that I want it. Once I'm happy with that, I'm going to release all the buttons on my keyboard and mouse. I'm going to go to my mask here. With white as my background here, I'm going to press Command Delete on my keyboard, and what that will do is fill that selection with white. Now remember, white reveals and black conceals. If I zoom in again, has improved the mask so we don't have any transparency here. Now if you didn't have white as your background color, you can either click on that and select that and press OK, or you can press D on your keyboard, which will make white as your foreground color, and then you can switch that by pressing this button or pressing X on your keyboard. I'm going to deselect this selection here by pressing Command D on my keyboard. Now let's work on this area here. Now it's a bit difficult to see, so let's view the mask a little bit bigger. I can do that by going to this mask on the layer icon here, press Option on my keyboard and click on the mask to see it bigger. Now I'm going to pan down here, and you can see that there is some gray area here. What we want to do is to make all this white. So with my brush tool selected here, or I can press B on my keyboard, I'm going to make sure that I have white as my foreground color. So because I've got white as my background color, I can switch that by pressing this toggle button or X on my keyboard. I'm going to make sure that my opacity is 100 and my flow is 100 and my mode is normal. And now with my mask selected, I am just going to paint that all over so the whole thing is white. Now I can zoom in by pressing Option on my keyboard and scroll the mouse up just to get a better view of the picture that I'm painting in. I'm going to pan around just to see if there's any other areas that I need to do. And that looks fine. Now we'll tackle this area here. I'm just going to select my Move tool by pressing V on my keyboard just to change my cursor. So we've got a problem here, and this will need to be 100% black instead of this grayish area here. We can use our brush tool again by pressing B on our keyboard or pressing here. Now the color that we want is black, so I'm going to switch my color here. But if I just start painting over this, it's going to paint over the objects that we want to preserve as well. So I'm going to undo that by pressing Command Z on my keyboard. I'm going to show you a special blend mode to deal with this issue. So let's change our mode from normal down to overlay. Now with black selected as my foreground color, I'm going to just paint over this, and magically it doesn't go over the area that is in white. Because what overlay blend mode does when I have black selected is to color in black those shades that are more than 50% darker. It won't touch any 50% lighter colors. That's why it's preserving the white areas. So I'm going to zoom out by pressing Option on my keyboard and scroll the mouse down. And I'm just going to look for areas where I need to color that in overlay. Here with the grapes, I need all the grapes to show, which means that I need my paintbrush to have white as my foreground now. So let's change our background color, which is white, to the foreground by pressing this toggle switch here. I'm going to change my mode from overlay back to normal, and I'm just going to paint that in, everything in white. Now don't forget, I can use the overlay blend mode if the area is a bit tricky. So let's change normal to overlay. Now let's just see the image back as the original image by pressing Option on the keyboard and clicking on this mask here. Now for this tutorial, I've done a very quick job in brushing out the mask. For yourself, just make sure you take the time to do your mask as nice as possible. Now I've done what I said I would do, which is to replace the background, but the problem is that this background is very flat. It doesn't look realistic and it just looks like, some random fruits have been just placed on a canvas without any context. What we need to do is add back those shadows. Let's make a copy of this layer here by pressing Option on the keyboard and then clicking on this icon here and then just dragging it all the way down here. And the reason why we've duplicated this layer is because we're going to use these shadows from this image instead of painting the shadows back again. Now what we need to do now is to make this color black and white. To desaturate that, you can go to Image, Adjustments, and then go down all the way to desaturate. The keyboard shortcut is Shift-Command-U, and that will desaturate the layer here. Now you won't see anything happening on this image here because it's obscured by all these other layers. But don't worry, there are a number of other steps that we need to do to make it show. I'm just going to turn off this layer here, and I'm going to invert this mask here because at the moment it's obscuring the background. What we want is the background to show, but not the foreground. And because we already have a mask, it's just that it's inverted. It's easier not to recreate the mask again, but to invert the existing mask by pressing Command-I on our keyboard. And with that, we brought back the shadows. What we need to do now is to bring back the color that we added in the beginning. Now let's turn on the visibility of this layer here, and then click and drag this layer all the way up the top. Let's change the blend mode from normal to color, and that's changed the whole image into blue. We shouldn't be surprised because it's what we asked Photoshop to do. But what we need to do now is just to mask out the areas that we don't want it to be blue. And the areas that we don't want it to be blue are the fruits, the lemon, the grapes, the cranberries. Luckily, we've already created a mask for that. We can use this mask here and replicate it for this layer here. So with Option selected on my keyboard, I'm going to click and drag this mask up on top here, and I'm going to release. It's going to ask me whether I want to replace the layer mask. I'm going to press yes. And ta-da! There you have the color of the background change to a color of our choice. Now, if you want to change the color of the background, all you need to do is double click on this solid color here and then selecting whatever color you like. Isn't that fantastic? I'm going to leave it on this blue hue here and I'm going to press OK. Now let's just review what we've done so far. I'm going to turn off all the layers to return it back to the original image that we've started with. And this is the original image. We made a selection of the background by using the color range feature. From that, we created a mask. We then fixed the mask by using the brush tool and brushed over the areas that we needed to show. We use an elliptical marquee tool here to quickly knock out a circle here and then filled it with white. We then put a background layer behind that. And because the image was too flat, we wanted to add shadows to it. So we duplicated this layer here and desaturated the layer and then inverted the mask so we just see the background and not the foreground. To add the custom color back to the image, we move this layer here all the way to the top. We changed the blend mode from normal to color, and then we replicated this mask here for this layer here. And that's how we removed and replaced the color background of this image in Photoshop. I hope you found this useful. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know what your favorite technique was or what you would like to see in future videos. Please like and subscribe and hit the bell icon so you can get notified for when the next video is out.